entity, an organism or machine that possesses some human qualities, right? Now, if we added the word plant to the beginning of each one of these terms, we have new fields of study or perhaps specializations within these areas of study. So plant ecology having a long history evolving out of ecological studies, specifically around plants' interactions with other organisms and their environment. Plant environment, so thinking about those dimensions, those zones from the microscopic to the macroscopic, we can think of our immediate plant environment, right? Like in an office environment, we can think of indoor plants. Then we can expand outward, and those concentric circles expanding outward to include our domestic home environment, perhaps our yard, the plants in our yard, and then the plants of our neighborhood, the plants of our region, the plants of our country, the biosphere, and so forth. Plant landscape, there's a term called plantscape, very much referring to a landscape that's been modified, especially its plant life, let's say its forests, for example, that have been modified to enhance aesthetic views, especially to enhance the picturesque. Plant nature, what is the essence of plant life? What is it to be a plant? This is a question in post-human plant studies. And then the plant non-human, we might think of the plantoid or some of these robotic AI forms of plant or plant-esque life that have been emerging. So we can add plant to each one of these ideas and specify it more within our study of the plant post-humanity. So I'd like you to think for a moment, what words spring to mind when you think of plants, right? And just write a few responses in the chat. Just take a half minute or so and give that some thought. And while you're thinking of that, and just freely, whatever comes to mind, what associations do you have when you hear the word plant? Just write some brief responses in the chat. And as you're thinking of that, I'm going to continue looking at our context in India, right? An incredible place for the plant humanities, for interdisciplinary plant studies. India having 50,000 plant species, almost a 1/3 or 33% rate of endemism. This is essential. Endemism means that a plant only occurs in that place. If it's outside of that place, it's being cultivated in a garden or a greenhouse, but it occurs naturally in that place. So India having almost a 30% rate of plant endemism. That's exceptional. The Indian region having approximately half of the world's aquatic flowering plants. Incredible, right? India being a center for agrobiodiversity, having contributed 167 species to world agriculture. How important is that in a world where agriculture is constantly being impacted by pests, by genetic engineering, et cetera, right? So where is the original home of those species that have colonized the world as agricultural crops? The home is in India, and that genetic diversity then therefore exists in India. So home to 320 species of wild relatives are made of major agricultural crops start to fail, or if they need to be enhanced, some trait they need to respond to, for example, climate change, then adding those wild genes to those crops will make a major difference for food supplies and so forth. And these distinctive regions, right? The Himalayan flora compared to the Indo-Gangetic Plain and Peninsular India. So the point is, India is a remarkable place for this kind of study. Recorded to be one of the largest tree specimens in the world. It's one tree, amazingly so, right? So it's one banyan tree that's created all of these offshoots that have become much like trunks. But what you're looking at is one tree. It's quite incredible to see. And there it is, the Great Banyan. I believe these sorts of banyan are across India, but because of the way the banyan grows, it's one massive organism. And this feels, the plant humanity really within the 6 to 7 year intersections with humankind. And so plant humanities really applies humanistic and I would argue post-humanistic modes of interpretation in the study of plant, right? So it's really taking a very broad view of plants. Remarkable scope, as the authors have commented here. I would say the scope is even more remarkable, not only because of the cultural and biological diversity within India, but the ways in which plants ability in other forms, right? It's quite a remarkable cultural context for the plant humanities. So if you've come across this field, you would have encountered a number of competing terms. And I just want to add some nuance to how these terms are connected to one another. So plant humanities is certainly connected to what's been called critical plant studies. Critical plant studies comes out of continental European philosophy, really examining the role of plants in Western so critical plant studies, very much the philosophical tradition, very, very similar. Human plant studies provides a kind of analog to human animal studies, or HAS. This is a field that has about a 30-year history. And so human plant studies offers a plant-based version of human animal studies, a very interdisciplinary approach to animals and society. In the case of HAS, cultural studies, the plants very much based in cultural, using the methods and theories of cultural studies. So, for example, geography, plant geography being a very established area of geography, looking at plant distributions, human plant interactions over certain geographical coverages. Transdisciplinary plant studies is a term that I prefer. Sometimes you'll see interdisciplinary studies. Transdisciplinary means it's using the methods and theories and frameworks of discipline between disciplines. Unlike interdisciplinarity, which tends to economic botany and ethnobotany coming out of the discipline of anthropology. There's also plant-focused studies in art, film, and performance. Phytocritic of science, looking at the science of how plants remember, how they communicate, how they sense the world. And finally, we should recognize the history of botany as a proper study within history. Now, the plant humanities is informed by all of these. So you can think of the plant humanities as the broadest framework available for studying human-plant interactions. So that's how I view the plant humanities. So what kinds of theories and methodologies might we explore if we're doing plant humanities research? Well, certainly historical and archival research is a good first port of call. There are lots of archives that we could online, and also physical archives that we could examine regarding particular plants or particular human uses of plants or perceptions of plants. So archival research, ethnography. So interviewing people who are expert in some way or another about plants. But I also want to suggest that it's possible to interview a plant. And this is where posthumanism comes in handy because it provides a framework for turning the terms of relation in a different way, right? Reconfiguring those terms so that rather than the plant being an object, the plant can be its subject in our ethnographic research. And there have been some studies on how to interview plants, Hartigan being one. Textual and discourse analysis, very, very easy, right? Very easy for literary studies and communications studies scholars, and certainly digital methods, AI, and even quantum methods, collaborative multi-species frameworks, right? So conducting research that is not so much about the plant, but that is research with the plant, right? So this is really the new prospect of studying plants, working with plants as participants and collaborators, and then creative arts-based or practice-led approaches. Once again, oftentimes with plants as contributors, as practitioners, and less so about plants, right? So those are some of the domains. One of the questions within plant studies is, what is plant agency? Agency being a very important question in the environmental humanities and certainly in posthumanism. You can think of plant agency as the capacity of plants to interact with and shape their environments, right? So that they are not only acted upon, but they're acting in response. They're shaping other plants, they're shaping their habitats, they're shaping the lives of animals and humans. We can also think of plant agency as countering a view of plants as automatons. A plant has a will. A plant has a form of intentionality. A plant can make a decision. Therefore, it is much different to the Cartesian view of a plant as something that's just mechanically responding to the world. So science affirms these ideas, and certainly these are essential for post-human plant studies. The idea of intelligence in plants, percipience, and when we look at science fiction of plants, or science fiction works that include plants, we often find these attributes narrativized. So intelligence, percipience, the sensorial powers of plants, plants having memory, behavior, altruism, and even the capacity to suffer, right, in plants. And so plant agency is not something we have to confer to plants. It's something that exists already, and it's simply about, once again, unmasking our perception of plants so that we can engage with these attributes. So this idea of plant agency really transforms, or has the potential to transform, how we approach plants in a variety of disciplines. We also essential to plants within posthumanisms is the idea that plants are narrative beings, and there are different ways of understanding this. Of course, as literary scholars, we recognize that plants are often characters in different narratives across time and traditions. So they are closely implicated in our narratives and our stories, so they are narrativized. But in the new materialist sense, they are also narrative in themselves. So lots of new materialist thinking talks about narrative matter. So we can think of plants as a storied material presence. And if you've ever looked at a tree ring, for example, you can see histories within the physical presence of the tree, right? So we can see in the tree ring, if you've seen a tree that's been cut, you can see certain rings indicate there was a drought that year or a pestilence or something like that. So plants are narrative in their storied presence. Maybe you may not be aware of durian in South Asia. It's not so popular, but certainly in Southeast Asia, durian is a very popular fruit, and it has a powerful stench. the powerful stench can be interpreted as the narrative presence of that plant. So that's what we mean by plants as having a narrative presence. In our stories, plants also serve as narrative agents, right? They provide setting, they drive plots, they provide symbolism, and so forth. And oftentimes they're narrators in themselves, right? Stories or poems that are presented from the perspective of a plant as a character, right? So there are different ways that you can conceptualize a plant as a narrative being. And so if we think of plant post-humanities, and once again, I'm arguing that we need to think of a plant post-humanities, a post-human approach to plants. And the reason I suggest this is because a lot of the science coming out now, although it discloses these remarkable capacities of plants, it's very much humanizing the plant. So the plant has value if it has a kind of memory that is human-like, if it can deal with stress in a way that's recognizable by humans, if the plant can so-called forget certain memories that may be harmful to future generations, right? If a plant can be said to have sensory capacities of smell and taste and touch and sight, and scientists argue this. So it's very much a humanizing paradigm. The new science of plants, which is sometimes called neurobotany, it's very much a humanizing paradigm because it's looking at plant capacities in terms of human capacities, altruism. Of course, the idea that a plant has altruism is phenomenal, but what it's doing is it's reducing the plant to a human kind of basis. Now, what's an alternative to that? I would argue that a plant post-humanities is an alternative. They're not limited to their bodily forms, but are permeable bodies, how plants are narrative, how they're temporal, how they are decentralized, right? The kind of intelligence in a plant is not connected to a brain, and many scientists have argued, well, the plant brain is located in the roots of many plants. What this is doing is humanizing the plant in not a very constructive way. So intelligence in plants may be a decentralized phenomenon. So a plant post-humanities would embrace plants' ontological distinctiveness. It would engender a new lexicon for articulating that distinctiveness, which is not human, which is not inhuman, but which is not human either. A plant post-humanities would resist the instrumentalization of plants. Now, in science, there's the term plant life, right? Plant life. When we think of the collective of a forest, all the plant life in that forest, I think what we need to think of is plant lives, right? That a plant can have an inner world. And this is where a plant post-humanities might take us. Plant post-humanities destabilizes this really entrenched post-enlightenment demarcation between plants, animals, humans, and other life forms. It's very, very difficult to get out of this hierarchy, and especially to view plants as perhaps having the advantage. When you think of the evolutionary capacities of plants, and if intelligence is a kind of an evolutionary capacity, then perhaps it's the plants who are more intelligent and at the higher end of that evolutionary hierarchy. Diverse porosities between plants and others is essential for this kind of plant post-humanities. Moving past what I call anthocentrism, the fetishization of flowers. Flowers are beautiful, of course. We love flowers. They're sacred in so many traditions, but there's an anthocentrism at play that may detract from the totality of the plant, its root structures, its connections underground, right? And so we can start to think of phytophilia as this deep affection for plants in their wholeness. Okay. So I mentioned the tree ring. This is very much storytelling. One of the storytelling methods of plant life is this embodied presence in the world that tells stories, and that we have to learn to interpret. It's a different set of interpretational skills, and it certainly points to a different lexicon, but it's a very significant part of a plant posthumanities is interpreting the semiosis of plants in the world. What are their particular forms of signification? All right. So I think I have about 10 minutes more. If I don't, please correct me. So what I'd like to touch on here briefly is the idea of phytocriticism as a practice of unmasking the cultural and literary value of plants. Phytocriticism is an idea that I've developed as a way to theorize a plant-focused form of eco-criticism. Now, there have been some recent works of fiction that have really highlighted this so-called new science of plants, plants having capacities of intelligence, perception, communication, sensing, and so forth. One of them is the Overstory, which is already 8 years old. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018, very much based on new plant science, and specifically around how trees within forests communicate through what's known as the mycorrhizal network. This is a network, communication network that's mediated by fungi. And so this novel really has captured I would say, the global imagining of plants and of forests as having these sentient, percipient qualities. And this is why literature is so important to reimagining plants and our relationships to them. We've heard of environments in literature, right, being eco-criticism. We've heard of animals in literature and zoo criticism. I suggest that we can think also of plants in literature. And the term that I give for that study is phytocriticism. Now, a plant text, years ago, 30 years ago, Lawrence Buell posited the idea of an environmental text. We can extend that idea to the study of plants, and we can think of plant texts of various kinds that represent plant life and our interactions with plants. And those interactions could be traditional interactions in the case of indigenous peoples' narratives, right? So plant texts. Phytocriticism as the practice of reading these various kinds of texts through a plant-attuned lens. So, for example, we can re-examine a Shakespearean canon through the perspective of phytocriticism, the symbology of flowers or characters' interactions with trees or whatever it may be. And this is what phytocriticism can do. It provides a new optic into particular literary bodies, right? Plants maybe that were by previous scholars considered just part of the background or just kind of symbols in or setting in a literary text. We can re-examine those in light of this, of what I presented so far, right? Plants having their own inner worlds, plants having sentience and percipience and so forth. And we can also engage in plant ethics debates through this framework of human plant studies, HPS. I mentioned human animal studies having this 30-year history. Human animal studies has been essential for debates in animal ethics. So therefore, we can think of human plant studies as being a framework for examining ethical debates related to plants. So, for example, should there be ethical guidelines at research institutions for working with plants? It could be the case now that many labs grow plants and then they die or they're no longer useful and they throw them out the window, right? So should there be ethical guidelines for research involving plants? That's the kind of question. It could also be questions of genetic engineering in plants and many other kinds of questions related to plant life. So plants and literature. What does phytocriticism do? Phytocriticism will counter the dominant approach to plants in literary studies, the approach that will assign symbolic value to a plant within a text. Certainly, plants are symbols in text, but they are much more than that. And so, phytocriticism will attempt to examine plant life as an active presence in those literary cultural works, not part of the background, not part of the setting, although they may be at times, but how a plant is active within a particular narrative, right? So the role of the plant and its dynamism in shaping that narrative and shaping cultural production more broadly, and how a narrative may engage with ideas of plants behaving, of plants having cognitive powers, of plants having memories, sensing, and so forth. We see this oftentimes in indigenous people's narratives of forests and plants, where these ideas are tacit. They're part of indigenous beliefs of plants, for example, having behavior. And how interestingly that traditional indigenous cosmology might connect with this new science of plants, referring to their behavior, to their ability to sense and have memory. And how does a plant maintain its otherness, right? So give it some thought just for a moment. How could you apply this kind of phytocritical approach to your current research? Something to think about. If any ideas come to mind, just write it in the chat. So in the last few minutes here, I'd just like to skirt by some of the rich options and possibilities for plant humanities research in India. We know that the plant humanities, as it's evolved in Europe and North America, is very much about research collaborations. The potential in India for this kind of cross-sector collaboration is very rich. We can think of museums like National Museum of Natural History, regional natural history museums. We can think of scholars working with gallery collections, especially galleries with botanical art holdings. So there's some examples there. And also researchers working with botanical gardens, like the Bose Botanic Garden in Kolkata, many others around India, and scholars working with herbaria, very important. Herbaria are scientific collections of plant specimens, often in pressed format, physically pressed, but the new kind of digital herbaria have lots of material available on an open access basis. You never have to go to the herbarium itself. The collections may be available online. So there's lots of this rich cross-sector possibility. The Indian Virtual Herbarium, what a great resource for someone interested in this kind of study in India. Okay, we can think of the history of major forest protection movements as a really important topic within plant humanities research in India, the Bishnoi movement being an example of that, a very important movement, in fact, for the evolution of Western environmental protection and activism and so-called eco-radicalism. So that's another brief example. We could think of major historical figures in the history of Indian botany, Sir Chandra Bose being a major figure who's been the subject of a number of recent studies, but whose work is so rich and so transdisciplinary that we could easily hone in on a particular aspect of his work. We could visit the Bose Museum, I think it is, in Kolkata as part of a research project. So major historical figures being another aspect of Indian plant humanities. Major current activists in forest protection in India, of course, Jada Mole Payang being a prominent environmental activist and forestry worker who basically has repopulated an island over several decades, repopulated with biodiversity, with plant diversity, right? So a fascinating subject for a study, perhaps using ethnography or these kinds of methods I've already mentioned. plants in Indian literature. What a rich wealth of literary traditions to draw from. So much there. Champak Blossoms by Sarojini Naidu being only one example of many, many. And so we could examine even one poem from the perspective of the plant humanities. How is the poet evoking the plant? Does the plant have a kind of agency in that poetic narrative, right? Is some aspect of the plant's conservation reference? Is it a culturally significant plant? And how is the poet handling that cultural tradition, right? What is the voice of the plant in that poem? Those are some of the questions we could ask. We could hone in on a particular plant like Tulsi and do a study of various home shrines dedicated to Tulsi. We could read the rich literature, sacred literature surrounding a plant like Tulsi or Tulasi as part of a very interesting plant humanities project. And so in closing, I'll just give a bit more detail about one final example, which is Rudraksha, Eliocarpus ganitris. Of course, a plant being very important in Indian cultural traditions. The stones here, pictured here, displaying this blue color, and then being dried and used as sacred beads in Hinduism and Buddhism, and some of the higher grade stones being sourced from the Himalaya. And as I understand it, there are sophisticated means of appraising Rudraksha beads, and I think you may know more about this than I do. And so this is the direction we can take when we hone in on one species and its rich cultural tradition. I was fascinated to visit some of the Rudraksha sellers. Their knowledge of Rudraksha is immense, right? So we could perhaps even interview some of these sellers and learn an incredible amount about Rudraksha beads, their cultural and spiritual significance, perhaps, and also their ecology, right? And here's some Rudraksha saplings. And so hopefully to stimulate your interest in the plant humanities and its rich potential in India. And in closing, the plant humanities is very much about the wisdom of plants. And I found this sign, in fact, at the Botanical Garden in Northeast India, I think it was. Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of the place. Gantok, yes, Gantok. Advice from a tree: stand tall and proud, go out on a limb, remember your roots, drink plenty of water, be content with your natural beauty and enjoy the view. The idea is that plants have wisdom to offer us, and the plant humanities is one framework for eliciting that wisdom and learning to attune to it. And as researchers, learning to channel that wisdom and that inspiration into our work. So I'll return to the question from the beginning: what factors are masking the human relationship to our vegetal kind, to our vegetal kin? Drawing from the lead term of the conference, right? Unmasking the human. What's masking the human relationship to our vegetal kind? So just write some comments in the chat. We can use that as a basis for any questions and discussion. And I'd also just like to conclude by promoting the CFP, if I may. I apologize for the self-promotion, but this is a conference on this topic of the plant humanities. It's happening in Shillong. It's called Botanical Life in Art, Science, and Imagination, and it's held in collaboration with NEHU in Shillong. So if you are interested in the plant humanities and would like to pursue it further, you're welcome to send an abstract by the 15th of March. And you can learn more about that conference at globalplanthumanity.org. humanities.com. Okay, so that's 15th of March. And so I'd like to thank you for your kind attention. And I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I look forward to any comments that you've put in the chat. So thanks very much. And thanks to the organizers, especially Dr. Chakraborty, for the chance to speak with you this morning. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Ryan, for your fascinatingly compelling presentation on plant-human kinship, and in particular your expansive treatment of the role that plants have in Indian traditional practices and in Indian literature and so on. But before I open the floor to questions, I have one or two comments that you might wish to address. The plant-human, kinship model works well in gardens and small farms and community, for systems, community practices. So I wanted to know from you, how can this kinship model exist inside an industrial food system, which is based on extraction and scale and efficiency? And what follows from this is kinship almost always is grounded in indigenous community practices. So how to respect these practices and these communities without commercializing these practices?
Yeah, excellent questions. So I would think, kinship would be a very difficult premise to uphold in an industrial agricultural model. I'm thinking of small-scale farming, organic farming. I'm thinking of what you might encounter in Sikkim or somewhere else where there may be these traditional models of farming based on some awareness of kinship relations. And I think kinship has an ecological basis. There's a notion of a kin-centric ecology that was proposed by an anthropologist named Enrique Salmon. I think it's a very good idea, kin-centric ecology. So an ecology that has a basis in kinship relations, indigenous relations especially. And so I think that it's fruitful to conceive of kinship and ecology as intertwined. I don't know how an industrial system would uphold that, or if it would simply commodify that kinship in a way. And I think that where we would find that is in this small-scale, organic, permacultural, sustainable gardening systems that we find in many parts of the world. So your second question is also a very, very interesting one, kinship coming out of many indigenous traditions. I've been critical in a way of how the environmental humanities has co-opted the idea of kinship, especially Donna Haraway, using the term quite, almost appropriating the term in a way. And yeah, I think it's something that the environmental humanities has to negotiate. So that's why I reverted early in my presentation to the scientific interpretation of kinship, which is not drawing from any indigenous tradition, but is arguing that evolutionarily there's this kinship relation. It's a hard evolutionary reality according to science. It needn't refer to an indigenous tradition, but when we connect that very interesting evolutionary view of kinship to some of the indigenous views, it can become kind of a synergy between science and indigenous thought. I'd say the risk is always there, much like taking a sacred plant out of its cultural context and commodifying it. If we think of Tulasi, for example, we find Tulsi language when a term like kinship is taken out of its indigenous context. I would say it's just something to be aware of and to be dealt with respectfully. And if we're working with indigenous texts, we might just provide as much as we can of that that indigenous perspective by, for example, also referring to indigenous researchers. I do that, say, in working with Australian Aboriginal narratives. Uh, what do indigenous Australian researchers say about those ideas of kinship or of the dreaming or country in the Australian context? So, yeah, it's a question for sure, and I agree that there's some appropriation in that work, especially with the idea of kinship and in the way it's been used. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. The second question that well, not a question, I just wanted to know, is there any legal framework globally that can meaningfully support this idea of kinship with plants?
Yes, there is work that's been done in Europe, especially Switzerland, on plant ethics. Plant ethics and plant kinship, I mean, there's some common ground there. I would say a plant ethics isn't necessarily one that recognizes kinship, but kinship implies a kind of ethics, doesn't it? Intergenerational responsibility. And so I would say the closest that comes to mind is the plant ethics framework. I think it's Switzerland that adopted this in about 10 years ago. It's a charter for, it's called the Dignity of Plants, I believe, or an ethical framework for plants. And Switzerland is the first country to kind of put this forward as part of their constitution, I believe, that plants have a right to dignity, that they deserve ethical consideration. And so that's been a model for lots of plant ethics. I would say another model really is the recognition of rivers as persons, as legal persons, and some work has been done in India, but also in Ecuador and other parts of the world. I think there's room to see how that could apply to forests or other or sacred trees, for example, being declared legal persons for the purpose of protection. So those are two that come to mind as far as how they relate to the idea of kinship. Yeah.
Okay. And my last question on behalf of the students.
Yes.
You talked about plant-attuned lens when you were talking about phytocriticism. So could you just explain that a little bit more, plant-attuned lens?
Sure. Part of becoming a plant scholar is learning about plants and learning about what they do over the course of the seasons or over the course of the day. For example, if we're studying the mimosa plant in a literary work, a poem, I would suggest that we should try to learn as much as possible about the mimosa plant, the touch-me-not, right? It's the plant when you touch it, it recoils. Yeah. It's a very striking one, but it has lots of other cultural significance and historical significance. So what I mean by a plant-attuned lens is a critical lens that's informed by these different epistemologies of plants. So it could be cultural, let's say, if we're the example of the mimosa, the touch-me-not, we might study its cultural resonances in a particular society, right? Let's say in India. Then we might familiarize ourselves with the science of that plant, the ecology of that plant. We might familiarize ourselves with how it's been domesticated and how it's been perceived as kind of like the closest to an animal, because it has this ability to clench and to move, right? It's fascinated people over many, many years. And so as we build that knowledge of the plant, we become more attuned to it in our critical approach. And then we could examine, let's say our object of analysis is a poem or a novel. We're better equipped to really recognize the multidimensionality of the plant, mimosa in the case of this example, as it's being depicted in the novel, the play, or the poem. And so that's what I mean by a plant-attuned lens. It's not that we need to become experts at botany or even experts on a plant, but certainly, much like eco-criticism would argue that we should be aware of what's happening in our environment. We should be aware of ecological issues from multiple perspectives, scientifically, culturally, socially, politically, and so forth, in order to develop a well-rounded critical analysis. And so in using the term plant to tune lend, it's kind of an extension of that eco-critical position, but extending it to plants, that we should familiarize ourselves with plant life, with the issues affecting plant diversity, and in the case of particular species, how they've been important culturally.
Okay, there's a question for you in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, the question is about decentralization in plants. Is it decentralization towards plants or decentralization of plants? That's a good question. I think the way that I described it was the decentralization of plants, how back in 1880, Charles Darwin and his son Francis wrote this book about plants. And at the end of the book, they theorized that the so-called plant brain is in the root of the plant. So Darwin and his son Francis theorized that the plant is much like a human being upside down. Its brain is in the roots, right? And its leaves are kind of extending out into the world. So that is very much a centralized view of intelligence. And what I think plants demand is a decentralized view of these capacities. If plants are intelligent, they're kind of intelligent across their whole body, across the whole system. If you think of a mycorrhizal network, which is that network of fungi and plant roots in forests, the intelligence is really spread across, right? Spread across the whole system. So it's decentralized. It's not limited to a brain or the equivalent of a brain. So that's the decentralized nature of plant life. But I think that also you could, as you pointed out in this excellent question, you could approach plants in a decentralized manner or a decentralized mode, right? So is it decentralization towards plants? Right. How might plants upset our notions of centralization, right? Of authority, of the relationship between the center and the periphery? That might be a question. So you could approach plant life through that perspective. So yeah, there are different nuances with the decentralization. The one I was referring to is very much encouraging a perspective on the nature of plants as a decentralized nature. It's the sentience of the plant is not in any kind of brain, right? When you cut off a plant leaf, the plant doesn't bleed and die like a mammal does. So because it's decentralized, it can regenerate itself, and some plants actually thrive, as we know, when they're pruned. So yeah, that's the idea there. Yeah.
And you got two more questions, I think.
Yes. The next is about plants narrated and storytelling as per the intention of the human author. So does it not conflict with the posthumanism concept of agency? Yes, that's a good point. So the story is constructed by the human, or so we are told, right? In many, let's say in an indigenous narrative that's inspired by plants. The first example coming to mind is let's say an Amazonian narrative. Many Amazonian herbalists and healers will say the story came from the plant. The story was gifted from the plant in a spiritual encounter with the plant. And so that's an example of the human being more of a conduit or a medium for the plant story to come forth. I think that is a reality that's not limited to shamanism or mysticism. And in fact, the plant is always, in a way, voicing itself through the human by virtue of our symbiotic interaction and interdependencies with plants. We need plants to breathe, right? This is just the reality of being human. So I would argue that the voice of the plant is intrinsic to the text, whether we recognize it as such or not, that it is part of writing, part of storytelling, part of the narrative is always it's kind of vegetal character, if you will, and that has much. That's probably my interpretation because of our deep symbiotic union with plants. So, yeah. So to answer your question, I would say it's always a dialogue. Storytelling, it's always a dialogue between the human storyteller and the subject, the plant, the animal. Yeah. And so maybe that's a post-human concept of storytelling. The next question is, sir, how do we use AI in the environmental humanities? It's a good question. Not much research has been done on AI in the environmental humanities, so it would be a good topic for research. Well, there are a number of ways. If we're doing an environmental project that uses big data, right? AI is one way, of course, to manage big data. Let's say we are doing a research project involving climate data, a huge amount of climate data. AI is one way to manage our data, to identify patterns and so forth. So that's one example of how you might use AI in environmental humanities research. How else might we use, let's say if we're doing a more artistic, arts-based project within the environmental humanities, we might use AI as part of our artwork, right? So it could be many things, but the environmental humanities also includes environmental art. And so if that environmental art project integrated AI, that's another example. So, but yeah, that's a good question, and it's certainly a budding area of research. The next question is, can kinship exist without emotional reciprocation? Absolutely. Yes, I believe so. I believe naturally there's emotional reciprocation there. And in my work with Indigenous Australian people, oftentimes the leaders of particular communities have totems. It may be a plant or an animal or even an insect or some other species or a bird, but they have a very practical relationship to that totem. If it's an animal, that totemic relationship doesn't exclude eating or killing the animal or the tree. So that's very interesting. Oftentimes it's a relationship based in care. So if my totem is a tree, I'll look after that tree. I'll want to make sure that it thrives. That doesn't preclude using the tree or cutting down the tree or killing the animal. So there can be kinship without emotional reciprocation, I believe. And if we look at that, once again, that example of the scientific view of kinship that I began with, there needn't be any kind of emotional reciprocation. Kinship is kind of a hard biological reality for those researchers because they're speaking in evolutionary terms and the kind of shared evolutionary genetic origins of human beings and plants. And so that's another example where an emotional reciprocation, it can be there, but it needn't be there because kinship is this evolutionary reality.
So that's all we have for today, Professor Ryan. And thank you for this fascinating session. And on the behalf of the organizers, I thank you for your presentation. And hopefully we'll be in touch on some other platform, on some other occasion on Plant Humanities. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for your great questions and for your attention. I've enjoyed speaking with you. Take care and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.